The sharp crack of an open palm against skin echoed through the diner, silencing every patron. Sheriff Harlan Tate stood over the fragile 72-year-old woman, adjusting his belt with a smirk of absolute impunity. He thought he had just put another local in her place, asserting his unshakable authority over the small town. But as Martha wiped blood from her lip, the sheriff remained blissfully unaware of one fatal detail. Her only son was an active-duty Navy SEAL, and he was coming home. The town of Oak Haven, Georgia, was the kind of place where the summer heat hung in the air like a wet wool blanket, and secrets were traded over sweet tea and grease-stained diner menus. For years it had been a quiet community, insulated from the rapid changes of the outside world. But beneath its charming, postcard-perfect exterior lay a deeply entrenched hierarchy, enforced not by the law of the land, but by the iron fist of Sheriff Harlan Tate. Harlan was a man who wore his badge not as a symbol of public service, but as a crown. He was a towering figure, broad-shouldered with a thick neck and cold, pale blue eyes that seemed to constantly scan the room for an excuse to assert dominance. For years he had run the county with a brand of corrupt, racially motivated policing that the higher-ups in the state capital consistently turned a blind eye to. Speed traps targeting minorities, unwarranted searches, and blatant intimidation were simply the way things worked in Oak Haven. At the absolute center of Oak Haven's daily life was a small, unassuming establishment called the Rusty Spoon. It was the only place in town where the coffee was strong, the pie was made from scratch, and everyone, regardless of their background, eventually had to pass through. On a suffocatingly hot morning, the diner was packed. The air conditioning unit hummed a steady losing battle against the heat. In the corner booth, sipping her usual black coffee and reading the local newspaper, sat Martha Ellison. Martha was 72 years old, a retired middle school English teacher who had taught half the town how to read. She was a woman of quiet, unshakable dignity. Her silver hair was always neatly pinned back. Her posture was impeccable, and her voice possessed a soft, melodic timbre that commanded respect without ever needing to be raised. Martha had spent her entire life in Oak Haven. She had marched in the civil rights movements of her youth, endured the slow, painful grind of desegregation, and had spent the latter half of her life pouring her soul into the community's children. She was also a widow. Her husband, a hard-working mechanic, had passed away years earlier. Her greatest pride, however, was her only child, Julian. Julian had left Oak Haven at 18, determined to see a world beyond the county lines. He hadn't just joined the military, he had excelled in it. Through grueling determination and a sheer refusal to quit, Julian had earned the Trident, becoming a special warfare operator in the United States Navy SEALs. He was currently attached to a Tier 1 unit out of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado in California, a detail Martha rarely bragged about but held close to her heart like a shield. That morning, the bell above the diner's heavy glass door jingled aggressively. The lively chatter in the Rusty Spoon immediately dropped by several decibels. Sheriff Harlan Tate strolled in flanked by two of his equally arrogant deputies, Wyatt Corbin and Lyle Mercer. Harlan didn't just walk into a room, he occupied it. He let the heavy door slam shut behind him, his heavy leather boots thudding against the checkered linoleum floor. He bypassed the line of waiting customers, ignored the hostess stand, and made a beeline for the center of the diner. Harlan had a regular spot. It wasn't officially reserved, but the locals knew better than to sit there. However, today the diner was exceptionally crowded. A young teenage boy named Cameron, the new busboy whose family had recently moved to Oak Haven from Texas, was frantically trying to clear the sheriff's preferred table. He was moving as fast as his skinny arms would allow, stacking heavy ceramic plates and wiping down the sticky vinyl. "You're moving like molasses, boy," Harlan rumbled, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of clinking silverware. Cameron flinched, dropping a fork. It clattered loudly onto the floor. "I'm sorry, sir, just give me a second," the teenager stammered, hurriedly bending down to pick it up. Harlan stepped forward, purposely putting his heavy boot directly over the dropped fork, trapping Cameron's hand against the floor. The boy gasped in pain. "I didn't ask for an apology," Harlan sneered, leaning down so his face was inches from the terrified teenager. "I asked why my table ain't clean. You people come into my town, you take our jobs, and you can't even wipe a damn table properly." The diner went dead silent. Brenda, the seasoned waitress who had worked there for years, froze with a pot of coffee in her hand. The patrons stared at their plates, suddenly deeply interested in their hash browns. Fear was a powerful silencer, except for Martha. Martha slowly folded her newspaper. She placed it on the table, aligned the edges perfectly, and stood up. She didn't march over, she glided, her every movement deliberate and calm. "Sheriff Tate," Martha's voice rang out, clear as a church bell on a Sunday morning. Harlan didn't look up immediately. He kept his boot pressed lightly against the boy's hand. "Mind your business, Martha. I'm having a conversation with the help." "Lift your foot, Harlan," Martha said. She didn't use his title. She used the name she had called him when he was a sour, misbehaving 12-year-old in her 7th-grade classroom. Harlan's neck flushed red. Slowly, he lifted his boot. Cameron snatched his hand back, tears brimming in his eyes, and scrambled backward toward the kitchen doors. Harlan stood up to his full height, turning to loom over the elderly woman. "You're overstepping, Martha," Harlan warned, resting a hand aggressively on his utility belt, right next to his service weapon. "I'm the law in this county. I suggest you go sit back down and finish your coffee before I find a reason to cite you for disturbing the peace." Martha didn't blink. She looked at him with the profound disappointment of a teacher who realizes her student is fundamentally broken. "There is no peace here to disturb, Harlan, only fear. And abusing a child doing his job doesn't make you a big man. It just proves what everyone in this town already whispers behind your back, that you're nothing but a fragile bully with a tin badge." The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. No one spoke to the sheriff like that. No one. The silence that followed Martha's reprimand was suffocating. The hum of the refrigerator in the back seemed deafening. Wyatt and Lyle, the two deputies, shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. Even they knew Harlan's temper was legendary. But striking out at a respected elderly woman in a room full of witnesses was crossing a line even in Oak Haven. Harlan's face contorted, the flush of embarrassment turning into a deep mottled purple of pure, unfiltered rage. His ego, fragile as glass and bloated by years of unchecked power, had just been shattered in front of his town. "You think you're untouchable because you're an old woman," Harlan hissed, stepping so close to Martha that she could smell the stale tobacco and black coffee on his breath. "You think because you taught half these cowards how to spell that I won't lock you up for disrespecting an officer of the law." "You can arrest me, Harlan," Martha replied evenly, her chin held high. "But you cannot demand respect while behaving like a thug." "Shut your mouth," Harlan roared. "Or what?" Martha challenged softly. "Will you stomp on my hand too?" Something behind Harlan's eyes snapped, the rational part of his brain, the part that warned him about cameras, witnesses, and the consequences of assaulting a civilian. Completely evaporated, replaced by blinding racist fury. Without another word, Harlan drew his hand back. He didn't just push her. He didn't just shove her aside. He swung his thick, heavy hand in a brutal backhand slap. The sound was horrifying, a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the diner's tin ceiling. The force of the blow lifted Martha entirely off her feet. She collided heavily with the edge of a nearby booth before crumpling to the hard linoleum floor. Her shoulder took the brunt of the impact, but her head whipped back, striking the base of the table. A collective gasp, followed by screams of horror, erupted from the patrons. Brenda dropped her coffee pot. It shattered, sending scalding black liquid across the aisle. "Martha!" she screamed, rushing forward. "Back off!" Harlan bellowed, his hand dropping to the grip of his pistol. He drew it just an inch from the holster, a universal threat that froze Brenda in her tracks. He glared at the horrified crowd, his chest heaving. Anyone else want to interfere with police business? Anyone. No one moved. The fear was paralyzing. A few men at the counter gripped their fists, their knuckles white, but the sight of the two deputies instinctively resting their hands on their own weapons kept them rooted to their stools. They were hostages in their own town. "On the floor!" Martha groaned. Her vision swam. A sharp metallic taste filled her mouth, and a slow trickle of warm blood ran down her chin from where her teeth had violently cut into her inner lip. Her left shoulder throbbed with a sickening intensity. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up on one arm. She didn't ask for help. She didn't cry out. She simply wiped the blood from her chin with the back of her trembling, wrinkled hand, smearing crimson across her pale skin. Harlan looked down at her, his chest puffed out, though a flicker of realization about what he had just done danced briefly in his eyes. He quickly suppressed it, doubling down on his arrogance. "Next time I tell you to mind your business, you keep your eyes on your damn newspaper. You hear me, old woman?" Martha didn't answer. She didn't look at him. She just gathered her purse from where it had fallen, used the booth to pull herself to her feet, and with every ounce of her remaining strength, walked out of the Rusty Spoon. She kept her back straight, her head high, leaving a stunned, terrified silence in her wake. What Sheriff Harlan Tate didn't notice, however, was the teenage girl sitting in the booth directly behind where the altercation had taken place. Her name was Riley Bennett, and she had her phone propped up against a napkin dispenser. The camera lens had been perfectly framed. Riley hadn't just recorded the slap. She had recorded the argument, the threat, the brutal assault, and Harlan drawing his weapon on the waitress. Her hands shook violently as she hit stop recording. She knew if Harlan caught her with this footage, she would disappear. As soon as Harlan turned his back to bark an order at his deputies, Riley slipped out the side emergency exit, running all the way home, with the most explosive piece of evidence Oak Haven had ever seen. Thousands of miles away in the sun-drenched, high-security compound of Naval Amphibious Base at Coronado, Chief Petty Officer Julian Hale was running his men through close-quarters combat drills. Julian was a ghost of a man, tall, built like a brick wall with dark, intense eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He had spent many years operating in the most dangerous, unforgiving corners of the globe. He had survived ambushes in the mountains of Afghanistan, direct action raids in the dead of night in Syria, and environments that broke ordinary men in half. He was highly decorated, possessing a silver star and 2 Purple Hearts, though he kept the medals locked in a drawer. To his teammates, he was a tactical genius, a quiet professional who led from the front. But beneath the lethal exterior, Julian was a deeply devoted son. Since his father's passing, he called Martha every Sunday without fail. He sent her flowers on her birthday and made sure her house was maintained, coordinating with local help from halfway across the world. When his commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Everett Lang, walked out onto the tarmac holding a ringing cell phone, his expression was grim. "Hale!" Lang called out, his voice cutting through the sounds of distant gunfire from the ranges. "You need to take this. It's your neighbor back home. She says it's an emergency." Julian's heart skipped a beat. A call from Mrs. Eleanor Thorne, the sweet old woman who lived next door to his mother, meant only one thing. He took the phone. "This is Julian." "Julian? Oh, Julian, honey!" Mrs. Thorne's voice was trembling, thick with tears. "It's your mama. You need to come home." "What happened?" Julian's voice instantly dropped an octave, shifting from a son's concern to a soldier's cold focus. "Is she in the hospital? Did she fall?" "She didn't fall, Julian," Mrs. Thorne sobbed. "Sheriff Tate, he assaulted her at the diner. He hit her so hard he knocked her to the ground. She's refusing to go to the hospital, Julian. She's locked in her house, and she's bleeding, and she won't let anyone but Dr. Evans in and... Julian, there's a video." The world around Julian seemed to freeze. The roar of the Pacific Ocean, the shouting of the recruits, the heat of the California sun. It all vanished. A video? It's everywhere, Mrs. Thorne whispered. A girl put it on the internet. The sheriff's deputies are already driving around town looking for the girl. Julian, we're scared. The police here, they aren't going to do anything to him. They protect their own. Mrs. Thorne, Julian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Go to my mother's house. Lock the doors. Do not let anyone in unless it's Dr. Evans. I will be there soon. Julian hung up the phone. He didn't scream. He didn't throw anything. The fury that bloomed in his chest wasn't hot and chaotic. It was ice-cold, precise, and infinitely more dangerous. He pulled out his own smartphone and searched for Oak Haven. It didn't take long. The algorithm had already picked up the violent local video. The title read, "Corrupt Georgia Sheriff Assaults Elderly Woman." Julian tapped the screen. He watched the grainy footage. He saw the sheriff intimidating the boy. He heard his mother's brave, steady voice. And then he saw it. He saw the massive, heavy hand of Harlan Tate strike the woman who had raised him, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. He watched her frail body slam into the wood of the booth and hit the floor. He replayed the slap once, twice, 3 times. Every time he watched it, a piece of his military restraint chipped away, leaving only the raw, primal instinct of a protector whose bloodline had been threatened. Lieutenant Commander Lang watched his chief petty officer. He had seen Julian in the aftermath of firefights, seen him lose brothers in arms, but he had never seen the look that currently possessed Julian's face. It was the look of a man who had just declared war. "Hale?" Lang asked cautiously. "What's the situation?" Julian turned the phone around, playing the video one final time for his commander. Lang watched in stunned silence, his jaw tightening as Martha hit the floor. "That's my mother," Julian said quietly. The stillness in his voice was terrifying. Lang looked at the video, then back at his best operator. "How much leave do you need?" "A week," Julian replied, already unvelcroing his plate carrier and dropping it onto the bench. "Maybe more." "Take what you need. Do you need me to make some calls? I can get JAG involved. Contact the FBI field office in Atlanta." "No, sir," Julian interrupted, his eyes locking onto his commander. "With all due respect, bureaucratic red tape takes months. That man is walking the streets with a badge and a gun, threatening the people who saw him do it. I'm going to handle this." Lang knew better than to argue. "Keep it legal, Chief. Don't throw your career away for a piece of trash." "I'm not going to break the law, sir," Julian said, zipping his duffel bag with a sharp, violent tug. "I'm just going to remind him that he isn't untouchable, and I'm going to make sure he never wears that badge again." Within hours, Julian was sitting in a window seat on a commercial red-eye flight out of San Diego, bound for Atlanta. He didn't sleep a wink during the long flight. He stared out the window into the pitch-black night, his mind running tactical assessments, gathering intelligence, and formulating a plan. Harlan Tate had spent his entire life bullying people who couldn't fight back. He relied on fear, isolation, and a corrupted local system to protect him. He thought he was the apex predator in a very small pond. But as the plane touched down on the Georgia tarmac, bringing Julian Hale back to the soil of his hometown, Harlan was about to learn a devastating lesson. He hadn't just struck an old woman. He had summoned a monster, and the monster was finally home. The sun rose over Oak Haven like a bleeding wound, casting long crimson shadows across the empty streets. By dawn, the humidity was already suffocating, trapping the scent of damp pine and red clay close to the earth. The town was suffocating, not just from the weather, but from a profound, paralyzing dread. The video Riley had recorded had gone viral overnight, garnering hundreds of thousands of views across the state. In response, Sheriff Harlan Tate had placed Oak Haven under an unspoken curfew. Cruiser cars cruised the streets at a crawl, their dark-tinted windows rolled up, a visible warning to anyone thinking about protesting. Harlan's message was clear. I am still the king here. At the edge of town, a battered gray pickup truck pulled into the gravel driveway of a small, white-clapboard house. The porch light was still burning, a lone beacon against the morning mist. Julian Hale stepped out of the truck. He wore a plain black t-shirt, worn jeans, and a baseball cap, pulled low over his eyes. He didn't carry a military duffel, just a small canvas bag. He stood by the driver's side door for a long moment, inhaling the familiar scent of honeysuckle and red clay, letting his senses adapt to the environment. To anyone passing by, he looked like a standard blue-collar worker returning from a graveyard shift, but a trained eye would notice the absolute stillness of his posture, the way his gaze swept the perimeter, checking the tree line, the neighboring windows, and the secure deadbolts on his mother's house. He walked up the steps, his boots making no sound on the wooden boards. Before he could knock, the door opened. Mrs. Eleanor Thorne stood there, her eyes red and puffy, holding a dish towel. When she saw Julian, her breath caught in her throat. She looked at the sheer size of him, the hardened muscle, the scars tracing his forearms, the cold, ancient look in his eyes, and she began to weep. "Oh, Julian," she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. "He's been driving past the house all night. Wyatt was parked at the end of the road just an hour ago." "Where is she?" Julian asked, his voice low, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "In the bedroom. Dr. Evans came by and gave her something for the pain, but she wouldn't go to the clinic. She said if she left this house, Harlan would frame her for something or lock her out." Julian patted Mrs. Thorne's shoulder gently. "Go home, Mrs. Thorne. Get some rest. I'm here now." He walked down the narrow, carpeted hallway of his childhood home, stopping at the threshold of his mother's bedroom. The blinds were drawn, throwing the room into a deep twilight. Martha lay in the center of the bed, her frail frame looking incredibly small beneath the quilt. The left side of her face was horribly swollen, a dark, sickening shade of purple and black stretching from her cheekbone down to her jaw. Her lower lip was split, held together by a thin layer of dried blood. Her left arm was immobilized in a makeshift sling across her chest. Julian felt a cold, heavy weight drop into the pit of his stomach. In all his years of deployment, seeing the horrors of war, nothing had ever prepared him for the sight of his own mother broken by a coward. As if sensing his presence, Martha opened her right eye. A faint, painful smile touched her good lip. "Julian," she rasped, her voice thick. "Look at you. You've grown even bigger." Julian walked over and knelt beside the bed. He took her small, fragile hand in his massive palms. He didn't squeeze. He just held it like glass. "Mom," he said softly. "Don't do anything foolish, son," she whispered, her fingers tightening feebly around his. "Harlan is a powerful man in this county. He has the judges, the commissioners. They all look the other way. He wants a fight. He's looking for an excuse to destroy anyone who stands up to him." Julian leaned down, kissing her forehead, avoiding the bruised side of her face. "I'm not going to do anything foolish, Mom. I'm going to do exactly what you taught me to do. I'm going to take out the trash." He stayed with her until she drifted back to sleep, fueled by the painkillers. Then he walked into the kitchen. He poured a glass of tap water, sat at the wooden table, and pulled out his phone. Julian didn't call the police. He didn't call the local media. Instead, he dialed a number that bypassed standard routing protocols, terminating at a secure terminal inside the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C. The man who answered was Special Agent Donovan Pierce, a former Marine who owed Julian his life after a botched extraction years earlier. "Hale," Pierce said, his voice instantly alert. "I saw the video. Tell me you're not in Georgia." "I'm in Georgia, Donovan," Julian said evenly. "Julian, listen to me," Pierce warned, his tone urgent. "We've been building a case on Tate for many months. Racketeering, extortion, civil rights violations, illegal firearms trafficking. We have a federal grand jury convening in Savannah soon. If you go in there and put him in the hospital, you'll blow the entire investigation. He'll play the victim and the whole system will protect him. He hit my mother, Donovan, Julian said. The lack of emotion in his voice was terrifying to Pierce. I know, man. God, I know. I saw it. It makes me sick, but you have to let the process work. The process is too slow, Julian replied. He's terrorizing a town. He's looking for the girl who filmed it right now. Soon she'll be missing or dead in a county jail cell. I'm not going to wait. What are you going to do? Pierce asked, a note of panic creeping into his voice. I'm going to accelerate your timeline, Julian said. I'm going to give your grand jury everything they need, wrapped in a bow. But to do that, I need tactical intelligence. Send me everything you have on Harlan's off-the-books operations, the warehouses, the drop points, the bank accounts, everything. There was a long silence on the line. Pierce knew he was risking his career, but he also knew what kind of man Julian Hale was. If Julian wanted Harlan dead, Harlan would already be a corpse. The fact that Julian was asking for data meant he was playing a high-stakes chess game. Check your encrypted folder in a few minutes, Pierce sighed. And Julian, if you get caught, I never heard of you. Understood, Julian said and hung up. Minutes later, Julian's tablet illuminated. He began to read. He memorized the layout of the county, the shift schedules of the corrupt deputies, and the exact location of a secluded warehouse near the Oconee River where Harlan Tate stored confiscated narcotics and illegal firearms destined for the black market. Julian closed the tablet. He stood up, adjusted his cap, and walked out the door. The hunter had identified his prey. By midday, the atmosphere in Oak Haven had grown downright volatile. Sheriff Harlan Tate sat in his air-conditioned office at the county courthouse, his boots propped up on his oak desk. A half-empty bottle of bourbon sat next to a stack of paperwork. He was furious. The video wouldn't go away. The county commissioner had already called him twice, sounding panicked about state intervention and public relations disasters. Idiots, Harlan muttered to himself, taking a swig from his glass. They didn't understand how this county worked. You didn't rule by being nice. You ruled by making people realize that crossing you meant total ruin. The door opened and Deputy Wyatt rushed in, sweating profusely, his uniform shirt stained at the armpits. Sheriff, we got a problem. Harlan didn't lower his feet. What is it, Wyatt? Did you find that little Riley yet? No, sir. Her house is empty. Her parents packed her up and sent her out of the county last night. But that ain't the problem. Martha Ellison's son is in town. Harlan paused. He slowly lowered his feet to the floor, his brow furrowing. The kid who joined the Navy. What about him? He's just a sailor. What's he going to do? Write a letter to the governor? Sheriff, you don't understand, Wyatt said, his voice cracking slightly. I saw him at the gas station down the road. He was just standing there pumping gas. But he looked at me, Sheriff. He didn't say a word, he just looked right through me. I investigated his record on the state database. He ain't just a regular sailor. He's a Navy SEAL, Chief Petty Officer, Tier 1 operator. Harlan's eyes narrowed. For a brief second, a cold spike of adrenaline shot through his chest. He knew what a SEAL was. He knew what they were capable of, but his bloated ego quickly reasserted itself. This was his county. He had armed men, the law on his side, and an entire armory at his disposal. I don't care if he's the president's personal bodyguard, Harlan snarled, slamming his fist on the desk. He's one man in my jurisdiction. He's a civilian. If he steps 1 foot out of line, if he looks at you wrong, you lock him up for intimidating an officer. You hear me? We don't back down in Oak Haven. Yes, sir, Wyatt said, though he didn't look convinced. Meanwhile, Julian was already executing Phase 1 of his operation. He didn't go to the courthouse. He didn't confront Harlan. Instead, he went to the local hardware store owned by an elderly man named Elias Boone. who had been a close friend of Julian's late father. The store was empty when Julian entered. The bell jingled and Elias looked up from behind the counter, his eyes widening. "Julian," Elias gasped, coming around the counter to shake his hand. "Son, I heard what happened to your mama. We are so sorry. We wanted to do something, but Harlan—" "I know, Mr. Boone," Julian said, his voice calm, reassuring. "I don't blame anyone, but I need your help. I need to borrow some equipment, and I need to use your back room for a while." "Anything you need, son, anything." Julian didn't buy weapons. He didn't need them. He had brought his own specialized gear in his canvas bag. Instead, he gathered high-intensity trail cameras, heavy-duty zip ties, a commercial-grade signal jammer, and several rolls of black duct tape. For the next few hours, Julian sat in the dark back room of the hardware store, reviewing the federal file Pierce had sent him. Harlan Tate wasn't just a bully. He was the head of a massive criminal enterprise. Every Friday night at the appointed hour, Harlan and his inner circle, deputies Wyatt and Lyle, met with a regional drug distributor at the abandoned Oconee River warehouse. They traded confiscated meth and unregistered firearms for hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, which Harlan laundered through a series of shell companies. Tonight was the night. Julian mapped out the warehouse layout using satellite imagery. It was a classic funnel design. One main entrance, two side fire exits, and an old loading dock. Perfect for an ambush. Late that night, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Thunder cracked across the night sky, and a torrential downpour began to lash the county, turning the dirt roads into thick, treacherous mud. The rain was a gift. It washed away thermal signatures, muffled sound, and reduced visibility to near zero. Julian dressed in full black tactical gear, his face obscured by a dark balaclava. He slipped out of his mother's house through the woods, completely bypassing the deputy car that was parked a quarter-mile down the road. He moved through the forest like a shadow, completely invisible in the darkness. He reached the Oconee River warehouse under cover of darkness. The massive, rusted tin structure loomed out of the dark, surrounded by overgrown weeds and broken concrete. Julian scaled a rusted fire escape on the side of the building with effortless agility. He found a broken window near the roofline and slipped inside, dropping onto a steel catwalk high above the concrete floor. He pulled out his signal jammer and activated it. Instantly, all cellular service and police radio frequencies within a wide radius went completely dead. At the appointed hour, headlights pierced the heavy rain outside. Two vehicles pulled into the warehouse: Sheriff Harlan's black police SUV and a luxury silver sedan belonging to the drug distributor, a notorious criminal named Raymond Holt. The heavy sliding doors of the warehouse opened, and the vehicles drove inside, their engines idling before being turned off. Harlan stepped out of his SUV flanked by Wyatt and Lyle. Raymond Holt got out of his sedan accompanied by two heavily armed bodyguards carrying submachine guns. "You're late, Raymond," Harlan barked, wiping rain from his face. "And my radio is acting up. The whole system is down." "It's the storm, Sheriff," Holt replied, gesturing to his bodyguard who walked over to the trunk and pulled out a heavy duffel bag. "Let's make this quick. I don't like being in this county any longer than I have to." Harlan nodded to Deputy Wyatt, who brought out a large plastic crate filled with bricks of high-grade methamphetamine and several dozen unregistered automatic rifles, evidence that had officially been logged as destroyed in the county database months earlier. Up on the catwalk, Julian watched the entire exchange through a high-definition night vision camera. The digital recorder was rolling, capturing every face, every word, and every exchange of illegal contraband and stacks of cash. It was the definitive nail in Harlan Tate's coffin. The federal case was complete, but Julian wasn't done. The law would take Harlan's badge and his freedom, but Julian was going to take his soul. With a silent, deliberate movement, Julian detached a small flashbang grenade from his vest. He pulled the pin, counted to 2, and dropped it directly into the center of the gathering below. Boom! A blinding flash of white light and a deafening localized explosion shattered the warehouse. The criminals screamed, instantly disoriented, clutching their ears and eyes as the pressure wave scrambled their nervous systems. Holt's bodyguards began firing blindly into the dark, their weapon flashes illuminating the smoke-filled air. Before the echo of the blast could fade, Julian dropped from the high catwalk, landing silently on his feet in the shadows behind them. The real storm had finally arrived inside the warehouse, and Sheriff Harlan Tate was about to find out that his badge couldn't protect him from the wrath of a Navy SEAL. The warehouse instantly became a chaotic symphony of blind panic, choking white smoke, and blinding disorientation. The flashbang grenade had detonated with a concussive force that temporarily scrambled the inner ear fluid and scorched the retinas of everyone on the ground floor. Raymond, the regional narcotics distributor, dropped heavily to his knees, screaming obscenities as his hands clamped desperately over his eyes. His two hired muscle men reacted on pure, undisciplined instinct. They squeezed the triggers of their submachine guns, sending erratic, deafening bursts of rounds ricocheting dangerously off the corrugated steel ceiling. Sparks rained down like lethal fireworks, illuminating the dust-choked air in strobing, jagged flashes. Julian Hale did not panic. He operated in a realm of absolute clinical focus. The sensory overload that crippled the criminals was his natural element. Before the echo of the initial explosion had even begun to fade into the rafters, Julian was already moving through the shadows like a terrifying, localized force of nature. He slipped behind the first bodyguard just as the man's weapon clicked empty, delivering a precise, devastating strike to the brachial plexus. Julian rendered the man's right arm entirely useless. As the guard gasped, dropping his weapon, Julian swept his legs out from under him, driving his knee into the man's spine just hard enough to pin him to the cracked concrete. In seconds, heavy-duty tactical zip ties were ratcheted tightly around the guard's wrists and ankles. The second bodyguard spun wildly toward the sound of his partner, hitting the floor, blindly swinging his rifle. Julian used the man's own momentum against him, stepping inside the chaotic swing, gripping the searing hot barrel of the rifle with his Kevlar-reinforced gloves and twisting violently. The weapon was ripped from the guard's grip, and a swift, brutal palm strike to the chin sent him collapsing backward into a stack of wooden pallets, completely unconscious before his head hit the ground. Within moments, the most heavily armed men in the room were neutralized, without a single lethal shot being fired. Julian moved seamlessly toward Raymond, who was still violently rubbing his watering eyes, trying to crawl blindly toward the safety of his luxury sedan. Julian grabbed the back of Raymond's expensive tailored collar, hauled him effortlessly to his feet, and slammed him against the side of the police SUV. Another set of zip ties secured the drug kingpin to the door handle, leaving him weeping and immobilized in the driving rain that poured through the open loading dock doors. Meanwhile, Sheriff Harlan Tate and his deputies were experiencing a terrifying realization. The lawmen were supposed to be the predators in Oak Haven. They were accustomed to compliant, terrified citizens who surrendered at the mere sight of a tin badge. But tonight, they were the hunted. "Toby! Wyatt, form up!" Harlan bellowed, his voice cracking with a mixture of raw, bourbon-fueled rage and creeping, icy terror. He unholstered his heavy service pistol, his eyes darting frantically through the lingering smoke. "Who is out there? Show yourself. I am the sheriff of this county, and I will put a bullet in your skull." Deputy Wyatt, trembling so violently he could barely hold his flashlight, backed away toward the rusted fire exit. "Sheriff, my radio is dead. There's no signal. We need to get out of here." "Hold your ground, you coward!" Harlan roared, leveling his pistol at the darkness. From the pitch-black shadows near the catwalk stairs, a voice drifted through the damp air. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, terrifyingly calm rumble that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, cutting through the sound of the torrential rain pounding against the tin roof. You like putting your hands on people who can't fight back, Harlan. Julian's voice echoed, cold and devoid of any human empathy. Let's see how you do against someone who can. Wyatt broke. The terrified deputy dropped his flashlight, spun on his heels and sprinted blindly toward the fire exit. He didn't make it far. Julian emerged from the darkness like a phantom, moving with frightening speed. He intercepted Wyatt mid-sprint, locking his arm around the deputy's throat in a textbook carotid sleeper hold. Wyatt thrashed wildly for a few seconds before the restricted blood flow to his brain caused his eyes to roll back. Julian lowered the unconscious deputy gently to the ground, securing his wrists. "Wyatt, shoot him! Shoot him!" Harlan screamed, pointing into the gloom. Wyatt raised his weapon, his finger trembling on the trigger. But before he could fire, a heavy steel crowbar, hurled from the darkness with astonishing precision, struck his wrist. The bone snapped with a sickening crack. Wyatt shrieked, dropping his gun and clutching his mangled arm, falling to his knees in the puddles of muddy water, accumulating on the warehouse floor. Harlan was now completely alone. The grand, untouchable sheriff of Oak Haven stood surrounded by the neutralized bodies of his men and his criminal associates. The warehouse was completely silent save for the drumming rain, the groaning wind, and Harlan's own ragged, panicked breathing. He backed himself slowly against the steel bumper of his police SUV, his pale blue eyes wide with unadulterated fear. He gripped his pistol with both hands, aiming it frantically at every shifting shadow. "Who are you?" Harlan demanded, his voice trembling uncontrollably. His bloated ego was completely gone, replaced by the primal terror of a cornered animal realizing it had stumbled into the den of an apex predator. "What do you want? I have money. The cash is right there in the bags. Take it. Take all of it." Footsteps echoed on the concrete. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps. Julian stepped out of the shadows and into the dim yellow glow of the SUV's headlights. He had pulled the balaclava off his head. His face was a mask of cold, calculated fury. He looked directly into the terrified eyes of the man who had brutalized his mother. Harlan's breath hitched in his throat. He recognized the intense, dark eyes and the familiar bone structure. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Wyatt had been right. The kid from the diner, Martha's son, the Navy SEAL, was standing right in front of him. "This isn't about money, Harlan," Julian said softly, closing the distance between them with slow, terrifyingly measured steps. "Stay back!" Harlan screamed, his finger whitening on the trigger of his service weapon. "I swear to God, Hale, I will end your life right here. You're assaulting an officer. You're a dead man." Julian didn't stop walking. He didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on Harlan's trembling hands. "You aren't an officer, Harlan. You're a thug wearing a costume. And right now, your hands are shaking too badly to hit a target at close range." Harlan let out a guttural yell and pulled the trigger. Click! Harlan's eyes widened in sheer horror. He pulled the trigger again. Click, click, click. Julian stopped a few feet away, his expression unchanged. "When I dropped from the catwalk behind you, I ejected the magazine from your pistol and cleared the chamber," Julian stated calmly, tossing the fully loaded magazine onto the wet concrete between them. It clattered loudly, sealing Harlan's fate. "You were too busy screaming at Wyatt to even notice. You lack situational awareness. You lack discipline. You lack honor." Harlan threw the useless, empty gun at Julian's head and lunged forward, throwing a wild, desperate haymaker, fueled by sheer survival instinct. He was a massive man, over 250 pounds, accustomed to easily overpowering the citizens of his town. But Julian was not a civilian. He stepped smoothly inside the wide, clumsy arc of Harlan's punch. With surgical precision, Julian drove the palm of his hand fiercely into Harlan's sternum, forcing the air from the sheriff's lungs in a violent rush. As Harlan doubled over, gasping for breath, Julian seized his heavy leather duty belt, lifted the massive sheriff entirely off his feet and slammed him mercilessly against the hood of the police cruiser. The heavy steel dented beneath the impact. Harlan groaned, tasting blood, trying weakly to push himself up. Julian grabbed the back of Harlan's neck, pinning his face firmly against the cold, wet metal of the hood. "You slapped a 72-year-old woman," Julian whispered, leaning in close so his voice was the only thing Harlan could hear. "A woman who spent her life teaching children in this county. You struck my mother. You thought there would be no consequences because you hid behind a badge. But out in the dark, Harlan, badges don't matter, only monsters matter, and you just invited one into your home." Julian swiftly secured Harlan's wrists behind his back with the thickest zip ties in his arsenal, pulling them tight enough to bite deep into the corrupt sheriff's skin. He yanked Harlan up from the hood and shoved him forcefully onto his knees in the center of the warehouse floor, directly beside the open crates of methamphetamine and illegal rifles. "It's over," Julian stated, stepping back. "You can't do this," Harlan spat, blood dripping from his nose. "I run this county. The judges, the commissioners, they work for me. You think some pictures of some drugs are going to lock me away? They'll throw the evidence out. They'll say you planted it. You're nothing but a rogue soldier, Hale. I'll make sure you rot in Leavenworth for treason." Julian reached into his tactical vest, pulled out his encrypted satellite phone, and pressed a single button, deactivating the commercial-grade signal jammer that had isolated the warehouse. "I'm not the one arresting you, Harlan," Julian replied quietly. Suddenly, the wail of high-pitched sirens pierced the stormy night. They weren't the low, rumbling sirens of local county cruises. They were the distinct, piercing sounds of federal interceptors. Within seconds, the warehouse was flooded with blinding red and blue strobe lights. Several armored black SUVs bearing the golden seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, accompanied by heavily armed tactical units from the Department of Justice, smashed through the perimeter gates and surrounded the building. Scores of federal agents poured into the warehouse, their weapons drawn, sweeping the area with laser sights. "FBI! Nobody move! Hands in the air!" a voice boomed over a megaphone. Walking calmly through the phalanx of armed agents was Special Agent Donovan Pierce, his FBI windbreaker soaked from the rain. He surveyed the chaotic scene. The unconscious bodyguards, the weeping drug distributor, the illegal weapons, the crates of narcotics, and the terrifying sight of corrupt Sheriff Harlan Tate, kneeling bound in the center of it all. Pierce looked up at the catwalk, noticing the high-definition cameras Julian had strategically mounted hours earlier. Every second of the illegal transaction and the ensuing takedown had been securely live-streamed directly to a secure DOJ server in Washington. There would be no corrupt judges dismissing this evidence. There would be no local cover-up. The entire operation was airtight. Pierce locked eyes with Julian, giving a slow, respectful nod. Julian had kept his word. He hadn't broken the law. He had simply gift-wrapped a massive federal indictment and served it on a silver platter. Harlan looked up at the swarm of federal agents, the color completely draining from his face as the devastating reality crashed down upon him. His empire was entirely obliterated. His power was gone. He wasn't going to a comfortable county jail where he controlled the guards. He was heading to a maximum security federal penitentiary facing decades of hard time for racketeering, drug trafficking, and civil rights violations. As two federal agents hauled the disgraced, sobbing sheriff to his feet and began reading him his Miranda rights, Harlan desperately sought out Julian's face in the crowd. But Julian was already gone. He had slipped quietly out the back fire escape, melting effortlessly back into the stormy night. The following morning, the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating an Oak Haven that felt fundamentally different. The heavy, suffocating blanket of fear that had choked the town for years had lifted. News of the midnight federal raid spread like wildfire. The townspeople gathered at the Rusty Spoon, speaking openly, laughing freely, breathing the sweet, unpolluted Georgia air. Back at the small white clapboard house at the edge of town, Julian sat at the kitchen table, gently applying a fresh ice pack to his mother's bruised face. Martha looked up at her son, her eyes shining with immense pride and profound relief. "Are you in trouble, Julian?" she asked softly. Julian smiled, a genuine warm expression that erased the cold warrior of the previous night. "No, Mom. The FBI handled everything. Oakhaven is safe now. You are safe." He poured them both a fresh cup of black coffee, the steam rising in the quiet kitchen. The monster had been vanquished, the town had been liberated, and the son had fulfilled his ultimate duty. Justice had finally come to Oakhaven, not delivered by the corrupted hands of local law, but guided by the silent, unyielding, protective force of a Navy SEAL. Thank you so much for reading this thrilling conclusion. If you love seeing this corrupt sheriff finally face the ultimate justice he deserved, please hit that like button and share this incredible story with your friends and family. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our daily dramatic stories of revenge, justice, and real-life heroes. Drop a comment below, letting us know your favorite part of Julian's tactical takedown. See you in the next one.